Hi, folks. I'm glad you could join me so that we could have a little bit of a lecture on the Greco-Roman world. I didn't do my makeup, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and we'll go straight to the lecture. Okay? When we talk about the Greco-Roman world, really we have to begin with the impact that Alexander the Great had upon this world. He lived a very brief and important life in the 4th century, and his influence was huge. He was not only a military leader, as most of us are familiar with, a person who conquered much of the eastern Mediterranean world. So he started from northern Greece, Macedonia, conquered all of Greece, all of contemporary Turkey, down all the way through what's contemporary Palestine into Egypt, and then all the way to the border of India. So he conquered a huge landmass, but that's not the most important thing. Alexander was not only a great military leader, he was a very well-educated man. He studied with Aristotle, and he loved and treasured Greek culture. So when he spread his empire, he took with it the aspects of his culture that he thought were most important. Of course, the language, and of course, the philosophy and some of the religions, the architecture, the political arrangements of the Greek city-state, and as well the laws and the understandings of Hellenistic or of the Greek culture, this ancient Greek culture. And what that did was, throughout this entire portion of the Eastern Mediterranean, we see the influence and the impact of Greek culture. Greek, Koine Greek, became the language of the day. Koine, let me go ahead and type that out for you. Let's see here. Over here in the notes, I'll start a new note. Koine, that means common. And when it applies to Greek, it means common Greek. One of the things that he did when he unified this entire empire was to have them all speaking Greek. So Greek language, the Greek educational forms, had Greek schools and Greek gymnasia that were started throughout the eastern part of the empire. That really informed the understanding of the people who lived in that part of the empire, the Jews included, especially those who were in Palestine, but also throughout, who had been in the diaspora in Babylon or in Egypt. So much so that the Jewish people used a Greek version of the New Testament, of the Old Testament, I'm sorry. And that is typically referred to as the Septuagint, LXX. I talked about this briefly in one of our lectures earlier. Septuagint. And that is the Greek version of the Old Testament. They did that because, or they used that version because that was the language that many people were speaking. If you could speak any language apart from your mother tongue, in the Mediterranean from really 323 BCE well into the 4th century CE, it was Greek. So chances are the disciples could speak a little bit of Greek. Of course, Paul could speak and read and write in Greek. And Jesus may have even been able to speak a little bit of Greek just to make himself understood, because that was the language of commerce. If two people from the empire and the Roman Empire met, chances are they would either have spoken Latin or probably Greek, especially in the eastern portion. So if an Egyptian met a Babylonian, really from the 4th century on, they spoke Greek. And of course, the Greek culture comes to have a real influence upon this part of the world. The other important thing that or influence upon the period that we're looking at is the Roman Empire. And here's a map of the Roman Empire that can show you the dimensions of this empire in the period when it says AD 63 under Domitius. So that would have been around the time that Paul would have been taken to Rome when he was taken captive. You can see the vast extent, and this entire eastern portion here would have been Greek-speaking because of the influence of Alexander the Great, and in fact, farther east, all the way into India, off the map here. So these folks would have been Greek-speaking and would have been deeply influenced, of course, not only by Greek culture. And so the Romans, when they took over this great territory, they spread with it the culture that they had inherited or stolen or adapted, depending on how you say that, from Greeks. So during the time in which Jesus lived here in Palestine and in which Paul was traveling here throughout Greece and Turkey, this was a period dominated by Greek culture and Roman forms of governance, and we talk about that then as the Greco-Roman world, the Hellenistic world, or Greco-Roman world. That distinguishes it from the classical Greek period, which is prior to Alexander. And then the Hellenistic period starts with Alexander moving forward, and so we can talk about the Hellenistic world or the Greco-Roman world as the world, the historical world in which Jesus lived. Now, what were the elements of that world? Starting from 27 BCE, you had a kind of peace. We call it the Pax Augustus or Pax Romana. It was and that's Pax is the Roman word for peace. It was a period of stability in this massive empire that was enforced through Roman power. So it's peace, but peace through war, because the Romans maintained that peace by having military forces in the occupied lands. And so you can see here, there were, at this period of time, skirmishes up in here in Germany, of course, skirmishes along the Scottish border or English border up here. And then, of course, Palestine was occupied by the Romans, and the Romans were not terribly positively viewed by these folks who they were occupying. So it's peace, but it's not the kind of peace where everybody's happy. It's peace enforced by terror. But it was also enforced by a couple of other Roman contributions. They built a network of roads throughout this entire empire. So you could travel from Palestine, really, and there were roads that could connect you all the way up to Britain. So by ship or by roads. And so they maintained peace on the seas so that you didn't have as many pirates, and these roads were pretty well patrolled. You can see the little red things here on those are roads, right? Or no, actually they're territories. Sorry, but there are roads that go throughout here, and in order to supply their cities, they built these huge aqueducts. They undertook huge building projects, and much of this in Europe stands still. Some of these aqueducts have been converted now to roads or highways. They still stand, and people still use them. Some of these roads are rural here out in the middle of nowhere, but most of them have been paved over and really are the unit still for the European highway system, just like the Indian trails today are in our country are covered over by where highways are. So these Roman roads, basically, they were the first sort of concrete structures or stone structures built in order to to allow for commerce. So it was a dangerous period, but also a very flourishing period economically, and a period in which you saw great travel. And most of the people, still, there was a large rural population, but most of the people that were interested in lived in Roman cities. And so you had a lot of cities throughout this empire. And, you know, most of Paul's letters are written to cities here, major cities around Greece and Turkey. And the earliest Christian movement, we believe, spread by missionaries who went from one Greco-Roman city to another. And that's important to keep in mind. The early Christian faith was an urban faith. It was a faith of the small Greco-Roman cities. Cities, you know, not huge cities. Cities of maybe 50 to 100,000. Rome, at its high point, was maybe 1 million. Some of them maybe a couple 100,000. So they're not gigantic mega cities like what we're talking about today up in New York or Mexico City or whatever. But still, large cities. And in these cities, people, the basic unit was the household. But it's not a household like what we consider to be a household. You know, we think of a household, we think of, you know, maybe a husband and wife and a couple kids and, you know, a dog or something. But these households were multi-generational families, and sometimes multiple families living together, connected through, ties of cousins or whatever. So you had grandparents and great-grandparents and maybe adult children living together in a house, and then you had and then smaller children, and so all generations. And of course, in some of the wealthier families, they would have had household servants or slaves who would have served the family, or co-workers, and everything was sort of. And here is a structure of one of these households, right? And you can see how you had various rooms. You know, up here you've got a shop. And many of the people in the household would have participated in the shop. This looks like some kind of a bakery of some sort. And then, you know, you would have had some bedrooms and shops back here, maybe some stables for animals, and rooms for people to sleep in up here on the second floor. You would have had maybe one room where people would recline and have their meals, where the masters would recline and have their meals. And these things were open to the street. People could come in and out. And they were open also in their design as a courtyard. Mediterranean climate at times gets hot, and so you have these open houses, and so the sun can come in. You've got here a nice little pond in the front, and here in the back, you know, you've got kind of a nice little garden where people can sit. And then usually in the back of one of these households is a shrine where you would have the family gods, the household gods, and also the household rules would be posted. And so in everyone, here's a depiction of these family gods. And the family gods would have been perhaps forefathers or important, significant people, that the elders that they would have kind of quasi-worshipped. And all of this was organized from a top-down system. So the highest, the head of the household, was known as the pater familias, the father of the family. And whatever he said went. He was sort of viewed as the family priest, also sometimes called the genius of the family, the person in whom the family spirit was embedded. And whatever he said was law in his household. So if a slave had a child and he wanted to expose the child, he could. If his wife had a child and he wanted to, he didn't want to keep the child, he could expose it. And exposure meant putting the child out on the garbage town dump, the town garbage dump, and leaving the child there in the sun to die, or to be taken up by slave traders, or to be killed by wild beasts. He had that power and no one could stop him. He could do whatever he wanted. And so the city was organized in these kinds of micro units around the family household, with the father being the head. It was very patriarchal, right? Very male-oriented, male-dominated. Women didn't have much of a say. And then the emperor was viewed as the father of fathers, the pater patriae. And so, oftentimes, sometimes in these household gods, you might also have a depiction of the emperor or some of the other deities that they worshipped. And the emperor was viewed almost as a quasi-deity. And he was the father of the great Roman household. And so whatever he said went. So this is how everything was organized. Very, 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 very hierarchical. The other thing that, let me go to the hierarchy here. So this hierarchical structure was very powerful, right? The emperor here was at this very pinnacle of this pyramid. And power was all concentrated in one person, more or less. And then, lower down on the hierarchy, you would have had maybe a dozen or so families who made up the senators of Rome and the knights of Rome, the governors and magistrates of the various territories of the Roman Empire, maybe a couple dozen families that were extremely powerful up here in the top. And everyone else was down here at the bottom. Roman citizens and soldiers above those who were non-Romans, and of course women and slaves, regardless of their status, were at the very bottom. At this period, there was no separation between church and state. The emperor, like I said, was viewed as kind of a god. The Roman pantheon, the Homeric pantheon, of course, is the same as the Roman pantheon. So Zeus and Jupiter were the same god, just different names for the same god. And while the emperor lived in Rome, Zeus and Hera and Poseidon, the other great Olympian gods, dwelled on Mount Olympus in Greece. And so that was sort of their capital. And there's this parallel, then, hierarchical structure. You had the great Olympians, and then you had local deities. In every different location, you had little. Sometimes it would be a grove of trees that where the spirits were considered to live, or you had demigods or others who were famous local heroes and considered to be godlike. Right? They were very low on this pyramid. And what's interesting is, just as your life in the empire politically was ordered under this great emperor, so your spiritual life was ordered under this one great god Zeus and the other Olympians in Mount Olympus. The basic form of religion, then, for the ancient world is what I would call paganism. Worship of multiple gods. And interchangeable worship. You didn't necessarily share one set of doctrines. It's not like today where Presbyterians have one set of beliefs, Methodists have a slightly different set of beliefs, Catholics a different set of beliefs, Buddhists a whole different set of doctrines. In this pagan world, you could worship whoever you wanted to, as was convenient. What was important was living your life to the best of your ability, and then you'd mix and match whatever gods happen to, fit your current situation. If you were going on a sea trip, you probably would worship one of the sea gods. If you were going on a journey by land, then you'd maybe select some other god to look over you, and you'd start worshiping them for a little while. If you were expecting a child, or wanting to expect a child, you'd worship some kind of fertility goddess or something. What was really important was not the afterlife. They didn't think about what would happen when you died. In fact, here is a typical. We find this kind of a typical Roman grave inscription, and says, "Non fui non sum non curon." I was not, I became, I am not, and I don't care, right? So very much focused on the present life, and whatever got you to your belief in the present life was, was the function of religion. So when you worshipped, what you did was you tried to please the gods. And you would please whatever god you felt would affect your current life. Like I said, if you were going to go on a trip on the sea, you'd worship Poseidon. If you were going to go to the games that afternoon, you'd do a little worship back to Fortuna so that you have good luck. And hopefully that your team or your gladiator or your racer would win so that you could win a bet. People used divination. They would look at the skies and see whether whether there were certain birds or certain kinds of animals, the direction of animals. They would they would engage in what's called extipacy, in which they would cut a sacrificial animal and look at the entrails. And depending on how the entrails were arranged internally in the animal, that would have some form of meaning or some other form of meaning. And they had people that you can consult. They had oracles and other kinds of folks that you could go and visit to find out what was going on. And people engaged in magic as kind of like a form of technology. This is a magic spell, a demonic magic spell from the period. You'd go to the local magician, you'd purchase a potion or a spell, and the magician would give you the potion or would say the spell on you, and the spell would somehow manipulate the gods. And, in here are different names of gods that the magician would call out and would perform little acts of worship to those gods, and that would give the person who purchased the spell or the potion some kind of special power. So if you found a woman that you were really trying to woo or attract, you could purchase a love spell. If someone had done you wrong, you could purchase a curse, and the person could make a curse upon that person. So and it wasn't like you really necessarily were devoted to one god or another. Just basically you would use religion as a means of trying to better your life. That's how most people viewed religion in the system. Now, there are a few exceptions. The so-called mystery religions do allow some exceptions in which you would have sort of a special devotion to one god, especially if you were in a certain situation. Asclepius, for example, is the god of the healing arts, and you all can see on this how he has the snakes around the stick. You've probably seen that symbol for doctors or for pharmacies. And people would go to a Asclepian temple, and they would spend the night there. They would worship there. Sometimes the priest would make a cast of whatever body part was ailing them, and they would offer sacrifice to the god and give up that cast, and hopefully they would be healed. So that was one where you could almost have a personal relationship. You hoped that Asclepius would help you out. Dionysius was also another god that sort of attracted cultic belief, a mystery cult or mystery religion. Basically, the idea was that people would, that Dionysus died and rose from death, and that somehow the experience of wine, which was his craft, he was a winemaker, of imbibing wine would bring renewal of life to people. And the Dionysians were crazy. I mean, they would go out in the middle of the night and they would get drunk and they'd run through the woods and they'd chase after animals and just in frenzied, hectic, crazy, drunken experience. They would experience ecstasy through that. Of course, the next day they would, live it off, they would experience the pain. But really, they could experience ecstasy through these Dionysian cults, and that was sort of this experience of dying and then rising again from the dead through their drinking, communal drinking of wine. We have some other cults that we don't know a whole lot about. Some of these mystery cults, we don't, we know that they had sacred texts, but unfortunately they were hidden, and so we don't have a whole lot of information about them. The Mithras cult has to do with fertility and power. Mithras was a bull and in the stars who apparently died at one point and then came back to life, and so people would come to worship this bull and as a form of power, and the killing of the bull and the spreading of the blood would somehow people would do that in a community, and that would give them a sense of renewal. That we think is probably one of the elements that played into contemporary bullfighting in Southern Europe, in Spain and elsewhere. And this idea, and some of these worshippers, I mean, they did crazy things. They'd take a bull and they'd slaughter the bull over a pit, and the people would be the worshiper would lie in the pit and have the blood pour upon him so that he could have the strength of the bull in him. You have kind of an Orphism cult. Orphis was another god that apparently died and was resurrected, as well as this Isis, who was related somehow, the mother goddess of Orpheus. And so you have secret rites associated with Orphic cults and the Isis cult, and people would go through some kind of weird mystical experience. They would be taken to the temple and in the middle of the night, and after having fasted for a week and would already be sort of out of their minds. And I imagine they would maybe even encounter some kind of maybe a drug of some sort, and they would have these visions of lights, and at the temple they would have people making sound and dressed up in all kinds of different strange clothes, and the person would have a vision of the various gods, and that vision would transport them into another realm. So you do have elements in these mystery religions. We just don't know a whole lot about them. But we do have elements of similar to a personal relationship, and with this theme of dying and resurrection, but nothing quite like Christianity, nothing quite like Judaism. And we'll be talking more about Judaism and the function of Judaism here in a bit. But the basic idea for Greco-Roman religion was that people worshipped whatever was convenient, and they worshipped whatever they needed to worship at the time. And there was not usually a devotion. And in fact, you could come into one of these mystery religions and do that for a couple of years and then go on to something else. So it's not necessarily like they were lifelong devotees to these religions. They would mix and match as occasions would arise. Well, I hope that gives you a little bit of insight about the Greco-Roman backgrounds and religious culture. Stay tuned for my next lecture, in which I'll be talking a little bit about Greco-Roman philosophy and how that influences the New Testament. Thank you, guys.